The Classical Anarchist. Part 4. Kropotkin continued. All things for all and anarcho-syndicalism. Lying behind Kropotkin's thought is a key assumption. All things are for all. Everything of value in human life is the result of the collective contribution of all, in which the specific contributions of individuals cannot be distinguished. What is made by all should be enjoyed by all. The means of production, he says, being the collective work of humanity, the product should be the collective property of the race. Individual appropriation is neither just nor serviceable. All belongs to all. All things are for all men, since all men have need of them, since all men have worked in the measure of their strength to produce them, and since it is not possible to evaluate everyone's part in the production of the world's wealth. So then, individual appropriation is not permissible, but neither is its polar opposite, state ownership. Voluntary cooperation is capable of supplying the necessary degree of organization required for communal enterprises. Kropotkin points to the International Postal Union, among other forms of voluntary non-state arrangements, to illustrate the way in which such cooperation could function. In the anarcho-communist society, there would be a form of property, but it would be one based on and limited to immediate and necessary use. The farmer cultivating just enough land, or the family living in a house with just enough space for them, or the worker working with just enough tools. All of these would be entitled to retain possession of those things they were using, and nothing else for as long as, and only for as long as, they were using them. Everyone, whatever his grade, in the old society, whether strong or weak, capable or incapable, has before everything the right to live. And that society is bound to share amongst all, without exception, the means of existence it has at its disposal. Organization we must have, if men are to flourish. But this good is not only or even best supplied by government. The kind of organization conducive to human flourishing will arise when men at last attempt to free themselves from every form of government and to satisfy their need for organization by free contracts between individuals and groups pursuing the same aim. The independence of each small territorial unit becomes a pressing need. Mutual agreement replaces law in order to regulate individual interests in view of a common object, very often disregarding the frontiers of the present states, writes Kropotkin. Distribution of the products of the economy would be based on need, not on the individual contributions of particular workers. The contributions of individuals would, in any case, be difficult, if not impossible, to discern. For anarcho-communists believe, a belief echoed by egalitarian thinkers before and since, that wealth is in the main a product of the collective contributions of our ancestors and our contemporaries. Everyone produces everything. Everyone should share in everything. Against this claim, a defender of private property might respond that while extant property is indeed the resultant of the efforts of many, they do not therefore have a claim on it if they have been remunerated for their efforts. Kropotkin makes the point, beloved of communists everywhere, that the fundamental material needs of humanity could be supplied by a small amount of labour on the part of everyone. Kropotkin has a wildly romantic conception of what life would be like under anarcho-communism, not unlike the earlier ideas of William Godwin and Richard Owen. According to Kropotkin, 5 hours work a day by those between the ages of 20 to 50, or thereabouts, would be enough to provide enough for all. The accusation of being unrealistically utopian is often levelled against anarchists as a whole. But in the case of anarcho-communism, the accusation would seem not to be wholly without merit, although Kropotkin was swift to reject it. He writes, "Far from living in a world of visions and imagining men better than they are, we see them as they are, and that is why we affirm that the best of men is made essentially bad by the exercise of authority." After that, all time and effort could be dedicated to the development of the spirit. What of the objection that in an anarchist society based on need, some will inevitably free ride on the efforts of others? Kropotkin concedes that some people may behave in this way, but he is confident that the majority of people will naturally behave socially, since man is by nature social. But what of the idlers and malingerers? Are they to be allowed to sponge off others? How can they be prevented from so doing if there is no coercive authority to prevent them? Here, Kropotkin has recourse to the idea of lateral social pressure and, if necessary, ostracism. He writes, "If you are absolutely incapable of producing anything useful, or if you refuse to do it, then live like an isolated man or like an invalid. You are a man and you have the right to live. But as you wish to live under special conditions and leave the ranks, it is more than probable that you will suffer for it in your daily relations with other citizens. You will be looked upon as a ghost of bourgeois society, unless some friends of yours, discovering you to be a talent, kindly free you from all moral obligation towards society by doing all the necessary work for you. And finally, if it does not please you, go and look for other conditions elsewhere in the wide world, or else seek adherents and organize with them on novel principles." George Woodcock is disturbed by this idea of lateral social pressure and seems to think it irreconcilable with the principles of anarchism. He writes, "A free society where the outsiders, those who are not in the ranks, are subjected to the moral condemnation of their neighbours may seem self-contradictory. Yet Godwin propounded the same idea 100 years before Kropotkin, and it is not out of keeping with the strain of Puritanism which disturbingly recurs throughout the libertarian tradition. Like all theoretical extremists, the anarchist suffers acutely from the temptations of self-righteousness. Woodcock's Millian point is not completely wrong-headed. Certainly, as Mill recognized, there can be a form of non-violent social pressure, characteristic of, though not confined to, small communities. But the non-violent nature of such pressure is vitally important. If you are willing to maintain your idiosyncratic and asocial proclivities, then do so. No one will physically harm you. But no one is required to associate with you or deal with you, and if they choose not to do so, then that is their prerogative. Moreover, Woodcock's characterization of such lateral pressure as a form of Puritanism is not necessarily justified. In a liberal anarchist society, it might well be the Puritan who is the one who is pressured into conformity or flight. Late in life, Kropotkin wrote the entry on anarchism for the Encyclopaedia Britannica in 1910. He takes anarchism to be a form of left-wing socialism, writing, "As to their economical conceptions, the anarchists, in common with all socialists of whom they constitute the left wing, maintain that the now prevailing system of private ownership in land and our capitalist production for the sake of profits represents a monopoly which runs against both the principles of justice and the dictates of utility." He denies any possibility of self-reform by the state. The state organization, he writes, having always been the instrument for establishing monopolies in favour of the ruling minorities, cannot be made to work for the destruction of those monopolies. He is aware of the wider anarchist family. He was one of the first to give Godwin his due as a precursor of anarchism. It was Godwin, he writes, who was the first to formulate the political and economical conceptions of anarchism, even though he did not give that name to the ideas developed in his remarkable work. Stirner, too, is recognized for his contributions. Kropotkin writes, "Individualist anarchy found its fullest expression in Max Stirner. Stirner advocated not only a complete revolt against the state and against the servitude which authoritarian communism would impose upon men, but also the full liberation of the individual from all social and moral bonds, the rehabilitation of the I, the supremacy of the individual, complete amoralism, and the association of the egotists." Kropotkin's comments on Proudhon extend to a brief consideration of some Anglophone contributors to anarchism. The ideas of Proudhon, he says, found quite a considerable following in the United States, creating a school of thought of which the main writers are Stephen Pearl Andrews, William Green, Lysander Spooner. A prominent position among the individualist anarchists in America has been occupied by Benjamin R. Tucker, whose journal Liberty was started in 1881, and whose conceptions are a combination of those of Proudhon with those of Herbert Spencer. Anarcho-syndicalism. Anarcho-syndicalism is opposed both to capitalism and to what it regards as the capitalist state. Whereas the anarcho-communists put their fate in unspecified voluntary associations, the anarcho-syndicalists find their operative organizations ready to hand in the form of trade unions. The kropotkinian idyll re-emerges in the claim by some anarcho-syndicalists that the needs of all can be met without requiring from the workers more than a few hours' work per day. The Pittsburgh Proclamation, in which this claim is made, goes on to call for the destruction of the existing class rule by energetic, relentless, revolutionary and international action. The cooperative organization of production, exchange between cooperative units without commerce or profit, and the regulation of all public affairs by free contracts between the autonomous communes and associations. In the words of one of its leading lights, Emma Goldman, syndicalism has grown out of the disappointment of the workers with politics and parliamentary methods, as a result of which it has turned its back upon parliamentarianism and political machines, and has set its face towards the economic arena wherein a lone gladiator labour can meet his foe successfully. While for anarcho-communists and anarcho-collectivists the means of production belong to all, for the anarcho-syndicalists the means of production in a particular industry, once appropriated from the capitalists, would belong to those who work in that industry. The workers' control of the means of production is thereby particularized and limited by industry. In a strange twist of irony, the workers, as the now owners of the industry, must make what are essentially entrepreneurial decisions, the decisions formerly made by the capitalists: what to manufacture and what to cease manufacturing, what plant and machinery to employ, whether to expand or contract, and so on. A further dilemma arises in relation to the disposability of a given worker's share in the industry. If workers are not allowed to dispose of their quotal shares, then those who prevent them from so doing are in reality the real owners of the industry. If they are allowed to dispose of their shares, then it seems impossible in principle to prevent a re-emergence of the distinction between owner and worker, the obliteration of which is the very point of syndicalism. I think it is reasonably clear from the foregoing that all these forms of left anarchism are unanimous in their rejection of the coercive state, but also to different degrees either suspicious or completely dismissive of the idea of the private ownership of external goods, deeming such ownership to be limiting or restrictive of human liberty. It would also seem to be the case that the root of the left libertarian position, such as that which we find in the work of Peter Valentine and Michael Otsuka and others, is that natural resources belong to everyone in some a priori egalitarian manner, so that robust ownership of them, such as for example ownership without positive obligations to others, by individuals is unjustified. For the left libertarians, this rejection of the robust ownership of natural resources requires their de jure owners to pay a rent or tax as a matter of justice to those who are excluded from their possession. This rent or tax would have to be paid to and distributed by some agency which, for those purposes at least, would constitute a de facto state, inasmuch as it would have to have the power to compel the payment of the rent or tax. Insofar as there appears to be an argument for the left anarchist and left libertarian approach to the ownership of external resources, it seems to depend on the claim that, since natural resources are not created by any human being, we have no reason to believe that the original appropriators of any portion of land are entitled to all its benefits. In contrast, libertarian anarchism regards the robust ownership of external resources as an intrinsic element in human liberty. Summary. Peter Kropotkin was perhaps the most reflective of the three classic anarchists. Like Bakunin, Kropotkin too was a member of the Russian nobility. Kropotkin's liberal and scientific ambitions prompted him to apply for a commission in a regiment stationed in Russia's Wild East, Siberia. On Zhukovsky's recommendation, Kropotkin went to live among the people of the Jura. Kropotkin returned to St. Petersburg as an apostle of anarchism. He engaged in propaganda work for which he was arrested and imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress in 1874. 2 years later he escaped from the St. Petersburg military hospital, travelling first to England and then back to Switzerland. Though never a card-carrying agitator in the manner of Bakunin, Kropotkin was at this time still attracted to practical organisation, so that his writings were only a part of his overall enterprise. Among the most significant of his publications was the production of the anarchist newspaper Le Révolté, for which at the start he did most of the writing. In 1866, Kropotkin returned to England, which was to be his home for the next 30 years. From this time on, influenced in no small way by his contact with the English socialist movement, he turned more and more to theoretical work and began to stress the evolutionary rather than the revolutionary elements in social change. The major works of this later period of Kropotkin's life were The State, 1897, and Mutual Aid, 1902. Kropotkin diverges from both Bakunin and Proudhon when it comes to the issue of access to goods and services. Access to goods and services is to be based on need, not on the specific contributions of any one person or group. Anarchist communism required the socialization not only of production, but of the distribution of goods. As with all forms of anarchism, anarcho-communism rejects the state, arguing that it is in no way coincident with society. Anarcho-communism not only rejects the state, it also rejects private property and capitalism. A key assumption of anarcho-communism is that all things are for all. Everything of value in human life is the result of the collective contribution of all, in which the specific contributions of individuals cannot be distinguished. What is made by all should be enjoyed by all. In the anarcho-communist society, there would be a form of property, but it would be one based on and limited to immediate and necessary use. Distribution of the products of the economy would be based on need, not on the individual contributions of particular workers.